It's always a little odd when I have to begin a sermon with a confession. Happens occasionally. So my confession is that I've had a very difficult time with this sermon today. So difficult, well, we won't go into that, but very difficult time with the sermon today. And I think part of it is because I'm so familiar with the story. It's actually one of my favorite stories in the Gospels. Could be because I have a sister, actually, who was born blind, so it touches me in a very deep place. But when you know a story this well, sometimes it's difficult to get something different and new out of it. And that was the space that I found myself in all week, actually. And so I was looking for a little inspiration yet this morning, confession number 2, and I came across this story that I like a lot. And it comes from this book called The Spirituality of Imperfection. And so just humor me for a second. And the story goes like this. A man took his new hunting dog out on a trial hunt. Presently, he shot a duck that fell into the lake. The dog walked over the water, picked up the duck, and walked back over the water to his master, laying the duck at his feet. The man was flabbergasted. So he shot another duck, and once again the dog walked over the water and retrieved the duck. Hardly able to believe what he had seen, the man returned home and called a friend, inviting him to go out for a shoot on the following day. And once again, each time he or his companion hit a bird, the dog would walk over the water and bring the bird in. But the friend said nothing, and neither did the man who owned the dog. But finally, unable to contain himself any longer, the hunter blurted out, "Do you notice anything strange about that dog?" The neighbor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, yes," he finally said. "Come to think of it, I do. Well, that son of a gun can't swim." Thank you for getting that. That helps what's going to happen next, so I appreciate that very much. So, I started when this story hit me this morning, it hit me that one thing that I think I lack sometimes is wonder and imagination. That once we've, see things, we stop seeing them, as Becca talked about. Sometimes we don't see anything at all, and it's easy to just go through the motions. And it's that way with scriptures, too. I mean, we hear these stories over and over and over and over, and eventually we go, yeah, I know that one. So when I read this story, it made me wonder, what is it that I'm not seeing? What is it that isn't kind of amazing me? What is it that I should be wondering about when I read this story again? And so there's some things that come to mind. First of all, I don't really wonder about a religious community that tells a person that they have an ailment because they're a sinner. We still do that sometimes. So that doesn't really surprise me very much. The thing that surprises me is that we still do it sometimes. But I wonder that in this story, it's amazing to me that no one asks Jesus to intervene. Not like last week with the raising of Lazarus, where Mary and Martha begged Jesus to come and heal him, or even the week before where it was a chance, happenstance encounter at the well. This time Jesus is just walking along the road and he sees the blind man and he is moved. And I wonder about that. I wonder about how many times God sees us in our pain, in our suffering, in our difficulty, and is moved to reach out to us and touch us. I wonder about this gradual seeing that this man has. So he goes and he washes and he pops up out of the pool, and all of a sudden he can see for the first time in his life. And that's amazing. But what's more amazing to me, what I really saw this time, was the way that his sight continued to expand. Because first he says, it was a man called Jesus. Right? And then he says, well, it was a prophet. And then he says, well, the man was from God. And then he calls Jesus Lord. And so it gives me this great hope that in those moments where we have an encounter with God, and God knows they never happen enough for us, I think, that we actually see them happening. But when we do, when our eyes are open, when we recognize God in the everyday to day things even, God continually invites us to see God differently and in a more deep way. See Jesus not just as a miracle worker or a man of God, but we see Jesus as Lord. And then I wonder, this is an interesting community this man lives in, right? He's been there his whole life. He's been sitting on the corner begging his whole life. And the minute he can see, and he no longer fits that role of the blind beggar, no one knows who he is. That totally blows my mind. That he has been with him the whole time, right among them, sitting in the pew next to him, so to speak. Well, except he couldn't go to synagogue, but you know what I mean. He's right there the whole time. They've walked by him every day. And now that he's no longer on the floor and begging, and he has been restored to wholeness, nobody knows for sure who he is. Then I think, well, of course they don't. Because A, they got so used to seeing him that way, they could not see him in a new way. And B, because when God begins to heal us, we become different people. And sometimes even our own friends and family don't recognize who we are. Because that's what God does. God makes us so new in our healing that the old us really does fall away. And I wonder about this poor man's parents. I mean, what a jam they're in, right? They get hauled in front of the religious leaders, put on the spot to defend their son. They have no idea what's going on, right? They just got here, so to speak. And they're pulled on the carpet to defend their son, and they basically abandon him. They said, well, we don't know anything about it. You go talk to him. We don't want to get in trouble. And that's not foreign to us either, is it? We find ourselves in those situations where the people that we were counting on, suddenly we look over our shoulder and no one's there. And then I wonder about those Pharisees. And I recognize myself there. And the thing about the Pharisees, the reason that they're such an important part of the story, is that they are so rooted in what they think they know, what they think they've seen, that they are unmovable. They're like the man in that little story I told you before. Oh, he can't swim. Really? That's all you got? That's all you saw? And so they've already decided who is allowed to heal. They've already think they know how God works and who God can work with. They think they already know that God wouldn't go anywhere near someone so unclean. They refuse to move. The thing they think they know, the God they think they know, is the only God they will allow to show up in the room. And I think, well, I do that all the time. I think, well, God couldn't possibly. Well, God would never. The Pharisees remind me that we're, the difference maybe fundamentally between them and the blind man is that we're all born a certain way. We have life experiences, and the difference is that the blind man was changed by his, and the Pharisees refused. Refused to believe that they might not have it right, that they might be wrong. Anne Lamott says this: the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. The minute we believe that we know what God is up to, the minute that we believe that we know who God approves of and disapproves of, the minute we are certain, we're in trouble. She goes on to say, and you can tell that you have created God in your own image when it turns out that he or she hates all the same people you do, or excludes all the same people you do, or determines less than all the same people you do. And I think that's really what this story is about. It's the difference between faith and certainty. That the minute we think we know what God is up to, we are no longer people of faith. And one last thought. One of the reasons that this is one of my favorite Bible stories is because I think it mirrors exactly how God continues to move in the world right now. Truth number one, Jesus came. Jesus showed up, incarnate God with us, in us, as us. And we look at the story, and we look at what Jesus does, and we wonder, how does this happen? How does a blind man get cured? How does a dead man get raised from the dead? And then what do? We argue about it. And if you notice in the story, one other thing is that from verse about 7 to 35 or so, Jesus isn't even in the story anymore because they start arguing about who he is and whether or not he's good enough, and Jesus can't be present in that, so he's not even in the story. Because when we see something, then we want to name it. We want to say, this is the truth. This is the truth, capital T, truth. And if you don't believe it, you are wrong. And the minute we do that, this story tells us Jesus goes away, waits for us to figure it out. And the last thing that I think is really good news is that this story, like the last two we've listened to, reminds us that again and again and again, God comes to us. God seeks us out, and God desires nothing more than to heal us again and again and again. Our job is simply to open our eyes and allow God to move differently, to see how God might speak differently than before, to see God in people we would never allow ourselves to see God in before. Because if we can take those scales off our eyes, we will see God in ways we never expected. And unlike the guy in the story at the beginning, we will be filled with wonder and awe for the amazing things that God continues to do again and again